USS Badger FF-1071. USS Badger FF-1071 was a Knox-class frigate in service in the United States Navy from 1970 to 1991. She was sunk as a target in 1998. History. The first Badger D-126 was named for Commodore Oscar C. Badger, a cousin of Secretary of the Navy George Edmund Badger, the father of Rear Admiral Charles J. Badger, the son of the Commodore and the father of the Admiral, was also honored by the naming of the destroyer Charles J. Badger D-657 QV, and this Badger FF-1071 honors all four men. Commissioning. Badger was laid down on 17 February 1968 at Todd Shipyard's Los Angeles Division, San Pedro, California, launched on 7 December 1968, sponsored by Mrs. Oscar C. Badger, and commissioned at Long Beach, California, on 1 December 1970. Commander William L. Britton in command. Badger completed fitting out at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard in January 1971, and then spent most of the spring engaged in tests and shakedown training. She completed final contract trials in May, during which Badger set the speed record for Knox-class frigates over 30 knots. The following month, entered the Long Beach Naval Shipyard for post-shakedown availability. During that availability, she received extensive modifications, including the addition of a basic point defense missile system (BPDMS) and of an independent variable depth sonar system. Because of those changes, Badger underwent a post-shakedown availability that lasted until mid-November. From that time until mid-March 1972, the destroyer escort conducted a series of underway tests and training evolutions, and underwent readiness inspections. On 16 March 1972, she weighed anchor and stood out of Long Beach on her way to the Far East. Along the way, Badger stopped at Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Guam before arriving in Subic Bay on 7 April. 1970s. On the following evening, Badger stood out of Subic bound for the Vietnam War Zone. She arrived in Da Nang, South Vietnam 2 days later, and, after a 4-hour layover, again got underway bound for the northern gun line near the mouth of the Cue Viet River. She began gunfire support missions on the 11th and, on the 13th, received her first counter-battery fire. 2 days later, she suffered superficial damage from a communist shore battery after her 5-inch 127 mm had been put out of action by a fouled bore and an overheated barrel. Later that day, the ship headed back to Da Nang to have her 5-inch gun barrel replaced by the repair ship USS Hector. She returned to sea on the 16th and soon arrived back on the gun line. On the 19th, Badger was switched to plane guard duty for the aircraft carrier USS Constellation in the Gulf of Tonkin. That assignment lasted 2 days short of a month. On 17 May, destroyer escort USS Albert David relieved her, and Badger shaped a course for Sasebo, Japan. 1972. Following a week of availability and liberty, Badger departed Sasebo on 29 May 1972 and, on 2 June, joined guided missile cruiser USS Sterett CG-31 on the Middle Sea Air Rescue SAR station in the Gulf of Tonkin. 4 days later, however, she was reassigned to plane guard duty, this time for the ASW support carrier USS Ticonderoga CV-14. After spending 20 days supporting the carrier, Badger returned to gunfire support missions on 26 June. On 7 July, the warship resumed plane guard duties, this time for the carrier USS Midway, and departed Vietnamese waters in company with that carrier. The following day, the ships moored in Subic Bay. Following upkeep, Badger headed back to the combat zone on 17 July 1972. 2 days later, she resumed gunfire support duties. During that assignment, the Ocean Escort joined 5 other American ships in providing gunfire support for operations carried out in Military Region Roman II by the South Vietnamese Army's 22 Division. On 9 August, she was assigned duty interdicting communist waterborne logistics and remained so engaged until 12 August, when she relieved guided missile frigate USS Worden as plane guard for Midway, once again headed for Soubic Bay. The two ships reached their destination on 14 August but departed again the next day bound for Hong Kong. Badger conducted an upkeep and liberty period at that port from 17 to 23 August and got underway on the latter day to return to the Philippines. She arrived in Subic Bay on 24 August for repairs before putting to sea on the 30th. Upon her return to the combat zone, the warship took up position as escort for the guided missile cruiser USS Long Beach on the Middle Assayer Station. During that tour of duty, she also kept an eye on two Chinese merchantmen in the area. When the guided missile frigate USS Gridley relieved Long Beach, Badger continued on station until 10 September, when she was relieved of Middle Assayer Station escort duties. Badger provided plane guard services for the carrier as she made her final air strikes of the war, and then escorted Hancock to Subic Bay, arriving there on 15 September. After 4 days in port, the destroyer escort put to sea and shaped a course for Yokosuka, Japan, where she made an overnight stop on 22 and 23 September before setting sail for the United States in company with Hancock. After a nonstop voyage across the Pacific, highlighted by several fueling at sea operations, Badger arrived back in Long Beach on 4 October. The usual post-deployment stand-down ensued, as did a restricted availability at the Todd Shipyard in Los Angeles, California. The latter began on 8 January 1973 and included the conversion of her main propulsion system to Navy distillate fuel and the installation of a light airborne multipurpose system lamps. 1973–1975. Badger completed those modifications on 18 May 1973 and put to sea for trials and single-ship exercises in the Southern California operating area. Normal West Coast operations out of Long Beach occupied her time until 9 July, the day she got underway for her new home port, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The warship made the voyage in 6 days, entering Pearl on 14 July. Training in the Hawaiian operating area occupied her until early September. On 11 September, Badger put to sea to participate in the four-nation exercise RIMPAC 73. However, a material casualty to her evaporators forced her to return to port for repairs on the 15th. She was back at sea the following afternoon, rejoined the exercise, and following its conclusion, returned to Pearl on 21 September. 3 days later, she set sail for Long Beach and arrived there on 1 October. The ship's crew then enjoyed a 16-day liberty call before the ship began her second deployment on the 17th. Badger rendezvoused with the carrier USS Oriskany to form Task Group TG-37.4, and the two ships then shaped a course for the Western Pacific. Augmented en route by the remainder of Destroyer Squadron Des Ron 35, TG-37.4 reached Subic on 5 November 1973. On the 9th, Badger departed Subic Bay in company with destroyer escort USS Bruton and ammunition ship Kiska bound for the Persian Gulf and the CENTO exercise Midlink 73. On the way, the ships stopped at Singapore. They arrived at Bandar Abbas, Iran, on the 23rd. From that port, she participated in Midlink 73 until its conclusion on 2 December. After a brief liberty call at Bandar Abbas, Badger got underway on the 3rd to return to the Philippines, again in company with Bruton and Kiska. The voyage included another visit to Singapore, and Badger re-entered Subic Bay on 21 December 1973. She immediately began a repair and upkeep period that lasted until 20 January 1974, when she headed for Guam. 4 days later, the destroyer escort arrived at Guam, whence she conducted special operations. Badger remained in the Mariana Islands until 13 February, when she departed Guam to return to Subic Bay. The warship steamed into that port on 17 February, and for the next month, on 18 March 1974, Badger put to sea from Subic Bay for a series of port calls beginning with a stop at Hong Kong from 21 March to 1 April. From there, she moved to Keelung, Taiwan, for a visit between 3 and 8 April. On the 9th, she moored in the harbor at Kaohsiung, Taiwan, for an 8-day stay before returning to Subic on the 18th. From 22 to 27 April, she operated in the South China Sea shadowing 2 Soviet submarines. She returned to Subic on the 27th and remained there until 5 May, when the destroyer escort began the voyage back home to Hawaii. After a stop at Guam, she reached Pearl Harbor on 18 May. Following leave and upkeep, Badger got underway for tests on her main propulsion plant and associated equipment on 21 June 1974. She returned to Pearl that night and remained in port until returning to sea on 11 July for final tests. During the full power run, the ship suffered a casualty to her low-pressure turbine and was taken in tow by the large harbor tug Waxahachie. Later, USS Reclaimer relieved Waxahachie and pulled the stricken destroyer escort into Pearl Harbor on the morning of the 12th. The warship underwent a restricted availability at the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, lasting until late October, and resumed normal operations in the Hawaiian operating area in November. That employment occupied her for the last 2 months of 1974 and for the first 2 months of 1975. On 11 March 1975, she put to sea to participate in Exercise RIMPAC 75, the multifaceted combat readiness exercise that brought together units of the American, Australian, Canadian, and New Zealand navies. The exercise concluded on 21 March, and Badger returned to Pearl Harbor to prepare for overseas movement. Badger put to sea on 17 April to rendezvous with sister ship USS Harold E. Holt and guided missile destroyer escort USS Schofield and Kiska for the voyage to the Western Pacific. The task group stopped at Guam for fuel on 28 April, but immediately after completing the operation, continued on to Subic Bay, where, after a short diversion to the South China Sea to assist in the evacuation of Vietnam, they arrived on 4 May. The next day, Badger was back at sea escorting Midway to Guam with a load of American aircraft removed from Vietnam. The 2 warships arrived there on 11 May, unloaded the planes, and returned to sea on the 12th. En route back to Subic Bay, she received orders diverting her to assist in the recovery of the American container ship SS Meigs that had been seized by the Cambodians. The merchantman, however, was freed before Badger's arrival on the scene, and the escort resumed her original course and re-entered Subic Bay on the 17th. She spent 2 days escorting Hancock in the local operating area before returning to port on 22 May. After a week of upkeep, she put to sea for Guam, arriving in Apra Harbor on 2 June to begin another period of upkeep. She remained there until 13 June, when she put to sea for special operations in company with Bruton. Badger returned to Guam on 22 June, spent 3 days there, and headed back to Subic Bay on the 25th. On the last day of the month, she put to sea as a unit of TG 75.1 to begin a 60-day training cruise to the Indian Ocean. 1 day out, on 1 July 1975, Badger was reclassified a frigate and redesignated FF-1071. That extended voyage brought exercises of all types: refueling, replenishment, towing, communications, gunnery, and engineering. She also made port calls at Singapore, Port Louis in Mauritius, Mombasa in Kenya, Karachi in Pakistan, and Colombo in Sri Lanka. The ship concluded that voyage at Subic Bay on 11 September. Upkeep there, including a period in dry dock, lasted until 29 September. On 1 October, Badger headed to Hong Kong. She arrived there on 3 October, and with the exception of 2 days at sea from 5 to 7 October to evade a typhoon, remained in port until the 9th, when she shaped a course for Guam. The warship arrived there on 15 October for 2 weeks of upkeep and operations locally for sea trials. On 29 October, she set a course for Pearl Harbor and pulled into her home port on 8 November. Her post-deployment stand-down period was followed, in turn, by a holiday leave and upkeep period. 1976–1979. During the first 5 months of 1976, Badger alternated training operations at sea with periods in port at Pearl Harbor preparing for her first regular overhaul. Late in May, the crew moved off the ship to quarters ashore, and, on 7 June, the ship officially commenced overhaul at the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. This work occupied her for the remainder of 1976 and through the first few days of 1977. She emerged from the yard on 11 January 1977 and conducted sea trials the following day. Further trials, inspections, and readiness ensued. In July, she began refresher training that lasted until the first week in August when she returned to Pearl Harbor. Badger got underway for the west coast of the United States in company with Decommissioning on 22 August 1977. Throughout the passage across the eastern Pacific, she joined the ships of Decommissioning in a number of exercises. She arrived in San Diego, California on the last day of August and remained in port until 9 September, at which time she put to sea to participate in local operations with San Diego-based units of the fleet. Badger returned to San Diego on the 15th and stayed until the 19th, when she returned. At the conclusion of that exercise, she headed back to Pearl, where she arrived on 1 October and began preparations for overseas movement. On 2 November 1977, Badger departed Pearl Harbor in company with USS Kitty Hawk and the other units of Decommissioning bound for the western Pacific. The warships arrived in Yokosuka exactly 3 weeks later, after an exercise-filled passage. Throughout that deployment, she conducted exercises with units of Allied navies as well as with 7th Fleet units. She also made goodwill visits to Singapore and various Japanese and Korean ports. The frigate also frequently called at Subic Bay for upkeep and replenishment. She concluded the deployment at Pearl on 8 May 1978. Post-deployment stand-down lasted until mid-June, at which time she resumed local operations in the Hawaiian Islands. Badger spent the next 9 months engaged in exercises and drills conducted out of Pearl Harbor. On 17 March 1979, the warship departed her home port in company with Bruton, USS Rathburn, USS Ramsey, and USS Lind McCormick, bound for another tour of duty with the 7th Fleet. After pausing at Guam for fuel on 29 March, the warships pulled into Subic Bay on 4 April and spent the rest of the month alternating exercises in the local operating area with periods of upkeep in port. During the first half of May, she joined Bruton and Rathburn in a round-trip voyage to Hong Kong for a Goodwill and Liberty call. Late in May and early in June, Badger operated with a task group in the South China Sea before returning to Subic Bay on the 11th. With the exception of a 3-day period at sea in the local operating area, she spent the remainder of June in upkeep and preparations for an extended cruise to the Indian Ocean. Badger departed Subic Bay on 1 July 1979 in company with Bruton, Rathburn, and Ussens Mispillion. The task group stopped at Singapore for a 4-day port visit before transiting the Strait of Malacca on 8 July and entering the Indian Ocean, where intensive exercises and drills in all facets of ships' operations highlighted periods at sea punctuated by visits to Colombo, Sri Lanka, and Mombasa. The latter stages of the operation were conducted in the Gulf of Aden and in the Gulf of Oman. The task group exited the Indian Ocean via the Strait of Malacca on 29 August and headed for the Gulf of Siam, where it joined units of the Thai Navy for exercise Sea Siamex X. At the conclusion of that exercise on 7 September, the ships made a 4-day visit to Pattaya Beach, Thailand, before shaping a course for the Philippines. En route, Badger was detached from the task group to proceed to Luzon independently. However, before reaching port, she was further diverted on a humanitarian mission, the rescue of 14 Vietnamese refugees adrift in a small boat. She finally arrived in Subic Bay on 15 September, all refugees safe. 1980s. Badger remained at Subic less than a week. She got underway on the 21st, bound for Hawaii in company with Bruton and Rathburn. They stopped for fuel at Guam and Midway before arriving back in Pearl Harbor on 4 October. Following post-deployment stand-down, the frigate resumed local operations out of Pearl late in December. On 7 January 1980, Badger began a 7-week availability at the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. Her repairs were completed on 27 February, and she began sea trials in the local area. Over the next 6 months, Badger went through the usual trials and certifications as well as all types of exercises and drills. In mid-August, she began pre-deployment training with a carrier task group formed around USS Ranger. That training complete, the task group returned to Pearl Harbor on 23 September for a final liberty call before heading for the Far East. On 26 September, Badger departed Pearl Harbor in company with the Ranger task group bound for an extended assignment with the 7th Fleet. The warships entered Subic Bay on 15 October, and Badger began a 10-day availability. Late in the evening of the 26th, she put to sea to rendezvous with the rest of the Ranger task group. On 30 October, the ships began the transit of the Strait of Malacca and the next day entered the Indian Ocean, the appearance of this task group in the Indian Ocean reflecting the seizure of the American embassy in Tehran by Iranian militants almost a year before and the holding of embassy personnel as hostages. Though the task group never entered the Persian Gulf, its training evolutions kept it within rapid steaming time of that troubled area. Badger and the task group remained in the Indian Ocean through the end of the year and into 1981, conducting intensive training of all types including multilateral exercises with allied navies. 1981–83. Iran's release of the American hostages occurred on 19 January 1981, but Badger and the task group to which she was assigned continued training evolutions in the Indian Ocean for 8 weeks thereafter. On 11 March, group retransited the Strait of Malacca and left the Indian Ocean behind. The warships re-entered Subic Bay on 23 March, and Badger began a 12-day upkeep. Just under a month later, on 16 April, the Ranger task group put to sea to return to Hawaii. After 12 days at sea, the frigate re-entered her home port on 28 April. During the month of May, the warship combined the customary post-deployment stand-down period with preparations for the periodic visit by the inspection and survey team. After the team's visit early in June, Badger resumed normal training duty in the Hawaiian operating area. That employment lasted through the summer and ended in September with her entry into the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard for overhaul. The period in the yard occupied Badger for the remainder of 1981 and the first quarter of 1982. She did not put to sea again until late May, when she began refresher training, inspections, examinations, and certifications. From then on, the frigate busied herself with the never-ending cycle of readiness exercises and drills punctuated by the usual material inspections and proficiency examinations. She continued so engaged for the rest of 1982 and the first 5 weeks of 1983. On 8 February 1983, Badger embarked on a 6-week cruise to the West Coast in company with some other DES-run 25 units, USS Cochrane, Osprey, and USS Lang. After completing a Comptux, a Redix, and a naval gunfire support requalification, Badger returned to Hawaii on 21 March and began a month of preparations for overseas movement. The frigate stood out of Pearl Harbor with USS Elliott and USS Brooke on 24 April. The 3 warships then carried out several exercises near Kauai on the Pacific Missile Range before beginning their voyage to the Far East on the 26th. After a passage that included a variety of drills and exercises and a 5-day layover at Guam for a short availability, Badger reached Manila on 16 May 1983. Underway again on short notice, leaving behind some 52 men who had been on leave and liberty at the time of her sailing, she carried out surprise ASW operations west of Subic Bay between the 18th and the 20th. Back at sea on 27 May, the warship conducted further ASW work in the South China Sea until the end of the month. Badger made a short stop at Subic Bay for fuel on 1 June and then set out for Japan. She took part in an amphibious exercise along the way near Okinawa before arriving in Yokosuka on 16 June. She spent 8 days in repairs at Yokosuka and then set a course back to the South China Sea, where she carried out surveillance missions until the latter part of July. Badger then returned to Subic Bay, where she made voyage repairs and requalified in naval gunfire support on the nearby Tabones Range. On 27 July, she headed back to Yokosuka, where she underwent still more repairs during the first 10 days of August. Badger returned to sea on 11 August 1983 and took up surveillance duty again, this time in the Sea of Japan. She concluded that assignment on 2 September and shaped a course for Sasebo, but received orders the following day to proceed north in the wake of the tragic downing by a Soviet fighter of Korean Airlines Flight 7 over Sakhalin Island on 1 September. Rear Admiral William A. Cockell, Commander, Task Force 71, and a skeleton staff embarked in Badger on 9 September via Lamps Hilo from Wakkanai, Japan, for further transfer to the destroyer Elliott to assume duties as Officer in Tactical Command OTC of the search and rescue SAR effort. During the forenoon watch on 17 September, however, Badger's embarked H-2F helicopter from HSL-37 Detachment 2 went down at sea. Usk Munro, however, promptly rescued the 4-man crew from the water. Badger ended her part in the KAL-7 SAR effort on the 20th and reached Yokosuka on the 21st to prepare for the voyage back to Hawaii. That journey began on 23 October and included participation in Exercise Battle Week 84-1, followed by a visit to nearby Prague, Guam, before Badger finally managed to return home on Armistice Day 1983. Admiral William J. Crowe, Jr., Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Command, visited the ship on 29 November and congratulated the ship's officers and men on their recent deployment, emphasizing their role during the KAL-7 SAR operation. Post-deployment leave and upkeep and holiday stand-down, broken only by a brief period underway on 20 and 21 December to escort USS Swordfish as she operated locally, kept Badger in port at Pearl for the rest of 1983. 1984-85. Badger got underway for the first time in 1984, on 9 January, when she put to sea for 3 days of tests and training with USS Omaha SSN-692. Following an inspection and survey to gauge her fitness for further service, she began a 2-month restricted availability. On 21 March, she finished the repair work and launched into a succession of post-availability trials, inspections, examinations, and certifications that continued through the middle of June. After that came refresher training in the local operating area until late July. On the 20th, Badger stood out of Pearl in company with USS Joseph Strauss and Amphibious Squadron Fib Ron 5 for 6 weeks of drills and exercises in the waters along the west coast. She returned to Hawaii at the end of August and then, except for 17 days in dry dock, between 28 September and 15 October, spent September and October engaged in normal operations in Hawaiian waters. During the last week in October, Badger took part in the first phase of a major fleet exercise with a pair of carrier task groups built around USS Constellation and USS Carl Vinson. After spending the period 2 to 6 November in port at Pearl Harbor, she returned to sea to conclude the exercise and then move on to the Far East for 7 weeks of additional exercises. Traveling with the Carl Vinson Task Group, she participated in a series of training evolutions conducted in such diverse places as the Marianas, in the Philippine Sea, and in Japanese waters. Badger completed her part in the exercises early in December and, after a visit to Yokosuka, Japan, set out on the voyage back to Hawaii on the 13th in company with Joseph Strauss. The 2 warships re-entered Pearl Harbor on 22 December, and Badger spent the rest of 1984 in port. Following an unusually brief stand-down, Badger resumed operations very early in 1985. She she put to sea on 10 January for a 2-week cruise to conduct operations in an area in the eastern Pacific about two-thirds of the way from Oahu to the northern California coast. She returned to Hawaii from that mission on 24 January and settled into more than 2 months of local operations out of Pearl Harbor. Then, after a special assignment in the vicinity of Midway Island early in April, Badger completed a 4-week restricted availability at Pearl Harbor. On 11 May, the frigate headed for the eastern Pacific once more. This time, however, she made it all the way to the west coast and took part in several exercises conducted in the Southern California operating area. Concluding a 4-week absence, Badger returned to Oahu on 14 June and began preparations to deploy overseas. After 6 weeks of getting ready, Badger stood out of Pearl Harbor on 2 August and joined the Orient-bound task group built around USS Kitty Hawk the next evening. The exercise-filled 17-day passage to the Philippines ended on the 19th at Subic Bay, where Badger began 5 days of repairs and meetings before heading to duty in the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea on 24 August. Along the way, she and USS Horn parted company with the task group to transit the Malacca Strait and conduct Exercise Merlion 85 with units of the Singapore Navy on 29 and 30 August. The 2 warships rejoined the task group in the Bay of Bengal on 1 September and, after recovering debris from a helicopter crash, resumed the voyage to the Arabian Sea. Badger reached the patrol area in the northern Arabian Sea on 10 September and began 4 weeks of duty on that station. Early in October, she made a 5-day port visit at Mombasa and then sailed back to the Arabian Sea, where she completed a tender availability alongside USS Ajax at Al Masra Island. Early in November, she called at Karachi, Pakistan, for a goodwill visit and carried out an ASW exercise with units of the Pakistani Navy. On 17 November, she rejoined the Kitty Hawk task group again south of Sri Lanka on its way back to Subic Bay. The task group remained at Subic for 6 days before setting out on the voyage back to Hawaii on 1 December. 1986–89. Reaching Pearl Harbor on 12 December 1985, Badger spent the rest of that year and the first weeks of 1986 in port, engaged at first in post-deployment and holiday stand-down, and, later, carrying out a 6-week availability. She put to sea for the first time after her return on 1 February to participate in readiness exercises near Kauai. Similar training activities in the local operating area kept her busy until the 2nd week in April. At that time, Badger stood out of Pearl Harbor for a 6-week goodwill cruise to the South Pacific. During the voyage, she called at Pago Pago and Apia. The warship arrived back in Pearl Harbor on 12 May and began a 4-week period of relative inactivity in port. Early in June, she put to sea to participate in a phase of the multinational exercise RIMPAC 86, and then returned to Oahu on the 14th to prepare for an extended training cruise to the west coast. On 23 June, Badger embarked on the 7-week round of exercises punctuated with visits to west coast ports that constituted EastPac 86. During that space of time, she visited Vancouver in British Columbia and the California ports of San Francisco and San Diego before returning to Hawaii on 9 August. For the remainder of 1986, the warship went to sea only rarely. She carried out some ASW exercises late in August and then spent 5 weeks in a maintenance availability. She returned to sea in mid-October for engineering drills and again early in November for more of the same and to complete a propulsion plant certification examination. When she re-entered Pearl Harbor on 14 November, Badger started preparing for a 3-month dry docking that began on 8 December. Although refloated on 2 March 1987, she did not resume active service for almost 2 more months. The repair work continued through March and during the first 2 weeks of April, and, although she returned to sea on 2 occasions during the second part of April, it was only for brief sea trials. Badger finally took up a more active schedule late in May with helicopter landing qualifications on the 20th and 21st and evolutions at sea during the last days of the month in connection with her material readiness in Spain. In June, the frigate resumed a normal schedule of local training operations and continued so engaged for the rest of 1987. Badger continued to carry out training missions in the Hawaiian operating area well into 1988. Late in March, she embarked on a series of battle readiness exercises that carried out during a 4-week cruise to the West Coast. The warship returned to Pearl Harbor from that assignment at the end of April and then spent the following 5 weeks in port. She resumed local training missions on 9 June, but those lasted less than a fortnight. On 22 June, Badger stood out of Pearl Harbor on her way to the Far East as part of a task group built around Carl Vinson. Though she made most of the crossing with the task group, Badger did not remain a part of it throughout the deployment. She parted company. After 5 days of repairs and upkeep, the frigate set sail for the Philippines on 22 July. She reached Subic Bay on the 27th but remained only 3 days, putting to sea again on the 30th bound for Singapore. Her visit to Singapore, however, proved a brief one, shortened by orders on 6 August to rescue Vietnamese refugees in the vicinity of the Spratly Islands. On the 9th, Badger took on board 57 survivors of a group that had originally numbered 104 and sailed for the Philippines. The warship disembarked the refugees at Subic Bay on the 10th and, after several days of upkeep, set out for Japan again. During the remainder of August and the first part of September, Badger called at a succession of Japanese ports. On 12 September, she put to sea from Yokosuka for 2 weeks of operations in the East China Sea with a task group formed around Midway. She then visited Pusan, South Korea, on 28 and 29 September, before returning to sea for 2 weeks of surveillance operations in the Sea of Japan. In mid-October, the frigate visited Chinhae, Korea, for 5 days and then carried out 4 days of training with units of the South Korean Navy. Next came a call each at Pusan in late October and at Hong Kong early in November. Badger returned to Subic Bay on 11 November and made preparations for the voyage back to Hawaii. The last 7th, the warship returned to Pearl Harbor on 6 December 1988, and her post-deployment stand-down lasted until 17 January 1989. She then resumed local operations in the Hawaiian Islands on a schedule that kept her moderately busy through the end of May. On 30 May, the frigate began an availability with a civilian contractor. Badger completed the repairs on 24 September, carried out the usual trials and examinations in October, and resumed normal training missions out of Pearl Harbor early in November. She remained so occupied for the rest of 1989 and well into 1990. 1990s. Late in March 1990, however, Badger undertook a new mission when she embarked a Coast Guard law enforcement detachment to carry out drug traffic interdiction operations. Her first taste of law enforcement duty lasted from 28 March to 12 April, and then she resumed more familiar duty until mid-June. On 18 June, she embarked another Coast Guard detachment and set sail for the West Coast to conduct another series of drug traffic interdiction missions in the Eastern Pacific out of San Diego. That deployment lasted until the beginning of September, when she transferred her helicopter detachment HSL-37 Detachment 10 to USS Owlet and disembarked the Coast Guardsmen at San Francisco. Badger arrived back at Oahu on 11 September and began a restricted availability on the 20th that immobilized her for most of the months remaining in 1990. Badger took up active training again early in December 1990, but that lasted only about 2 weeks. The relative inactivity of holiday leave and upkeep commenced in mid-December and continued for about a month. In mid-January 1991, the warship resumed local training operations and pursued them until early June. During June and early July, Badger voyaged to the West Coast one last time before being deactivated. She visited San Diego, California, Portland, Oregon, and Homer, Alaska before returning to Oahu on 16 July. Once back in Pearl, the frigate did not get underway again except to shift berths. Badger was decommissioned at Pearl Harbor on 20 December 1991, and her name was struck from the Naval Vessel Register in January 1995. The former warship performed her last service for the Navy on 22 July 1998, at which time she was sunk as a target during the United States Third Fleet exercise RIMPAC 98 at 22:50 once. Badger earned one battle star during the Vietnam War.